All right. So I think we'll get started with some introductions. I wanted to say hello and to thank you all so much for joining us today. I'm very excited to discuss the report, Delete the Issue, Tech Worker Testimonies on Palestinian Advocacy and Workplace Suppression, which is available now on Hamla's website in both English and in Arabic. And this is a co-hosted event between Hamle and the Tech Workers Coalition. So thank you all for joining us. The order of events for today, I'm going to introduce myself, introduce the report very briefly, and then introduce our speakers. And then we'll go through 3 rounds of questions, and there will be a Q&A at the end. We ask everyone to please add any questions that you would like to submit for the Q&A into the Q&A feature rather than in the actual chat itself. So please feel free to do that during the rounds of questions or at any point that anything comes to mind. Thank you again for joining us. So my name is Alexandra Fine, and to do a short introduction, researcher, writer, and advocate. My background is in academia, earning a PhD in cultural studies, and I went on to work as a professor of humanities, teaching on health and care, identity, media, and migration, and advocating for Palestine through Students for Justice in Palestine and Faculty for Justice in Palestine on my campus. Most recently, I was working with Hamla, the Arab Center for the Advancement of Social Media, and working on this report that all are joining us to hear more about today. And I'm continuing to do some more research related to human rights and technology. First, I wanted to thank Hamla and the entire team for their continued critical work to support Palestinian digital rights. I specifically want to thank Nadim, Eric, Zaina, Jalal, and Taisir, especially for their feedback and their help in the preparation of this report. I also want to specifically thank Eric Seip, the U.S. National Organizer for Hamle, who joins us here today, and Nadim Nashif, Hamle's founder and director, for their continued support and for their dedication and incredibly important work. I also want to thank the 25 tech workers who volunteered to be interviewed for this report. I want to thank them for their continued advocacy for Palestine within their respective companies and for their ongoing dedication to justice and liberation. The goal of this report was to highlight, and still is to highlight, the experiences of tech workers regarding advocacy for Palestine. These workers are firsthand witnesses to the various degrees to which suppression, bias, and discrimination are rampant within their tech companies with regard to Palestine. As I began this work, it became clear to me through the qualitative evidence that there was a systemic and structural bias against Palestinian advocacy within the tech workplace and spanning various companies whose workers I spoke to, including Meta, Google, PayPal, Microsoft, and LinkedIn, Apple, and Cisco. All 25 tech workers I spoke with experienced various types of suppression in regards to their Palestinian advocacy, ranging from microaggressions, HR recording violations on their files, direct threats from pro-Israel colleagues and leaders, doxing, the cutting or denial of worker benefits, and even directly being fired. From analyzing worker testimonies across companies, it also became evident that there were similar types of suppression occurring across companies, and that this included explicit and implicit bias, double standards with regards to advocacy for other political issues, such as that related to Russia, Ukraine, Black Lives Matter, fights for reproductive rights, etc. Additionally, it was chilling to realize how across companies, HR and leadership seemed to be responding to Palestinian advocacy in similar ways. This occurred when workers pushed back and called out company leadership decisions, company policies, and uneven enforcement of company policies, wherein support for Palestine was consistently being suppressed, over-moderated, silenced, or quite literally deleted. The qualitative analysis in the report is based on the information gathered from these interviews with 25 tech workers, which is just a small sample of the thousands of tech workers and workers outside of tech who globally are engaged in different forms of advocacy. In this report, the interviewees have not only worked at different tech companies, but have also worked in a range of roles, including in trust and safety, engineering, data science, events, community, and communications. They reside in various geographic locations, including the US, the United Kingdom, Australia, and they occupy various gendered, racial, religious, and ethnic identities. Through sharing some of these tech worker testimonies, this report aims to shed light on tech worker experiences with suppression and advocacy as a way to hold tech companies accountable, and also to encourage and support other workers, both in tech and outside of tech, to feel empowered to hold their companies accountable for complicity in ongoing violence occurring in Palestine against Palestinians and in the greater Levant, such as in Lebanon and Syria. By exposing what is happening internally at these companies, this report can contribute to ongoing efforts to push tech companies to be accountable to their own workers, as well as to the public, call for equity and transparency, to show other tech workers that they are not alone in their advocacy efforts. And further, enter the systemic and structural ways in which tech companies engage in Palestinian suppression, we can engage broader conversations on the questionable and compromised interests and investments of tech companies, and the ways in which these interests may support colonial endeavors in Palestine and in ways that aim to serve and support Western hegemony. So with that, I'm going to move to introduce our panelists, and then we'll go on to 3 rounds of questions and then the Q&A that follows at the end. So to begin, Eric Saip is a community organizer and advocate for Palestinian human rights. He is Hamle's national organizer in the United States and works to build a broad base of support for Palestinian digital rights within the US. Sophia Felipe is a former business development associate at Cisco and based in San Francisco. Standing in allyship for Palestinian justice, Sophia was the allyship and dialogue co-lead for the Palestine Network at Cisco Employee Research Group and was a leader for the Bridge to Humanity, a community comprised of 1,700 concerned Cisconians calling for the company's divestment from the Israeli government. And Mohammed Khatami is a former Google software engineer who was arrested and fired for protesting the company's military contract with Israel. He is a worker organizer with No Tech for Apartheid. Great. So with that, we'll move on to our 3 rounds of questions. So in this first round, we're going to think more about our experiences with tech companies and also think about advocacy and suppression in relation to what we've experienced. So for Sophia and Mohammed, at your respective companies, what sorts of violations and red flags did you witness that motivated Palestinian advocacy amongst you and your coworkers? And as more workers at your companies became engaged in Palestinian advocacy, in what ways did company leadership and/or HR respond or push back? So I'll have you two answer that question. And then after, for Eric, from the Hamle perspective, Hamle is a human rights organization that focuses on Palestinian digital rights. How do you see the issue of Palestinian advocacy and worker suppression in the tech sector?
Sophia, sorry, I guess we didn't coordinate. Did you want to go first? Or?
But you can go ahead.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I can talk at first. So the red flag at Google wasn't exactly necessarily like a red flag. It was kind of just this giant contract that kind of the advocacy for Palestinian liberation at Google emerged out of the announcement of that contract. I've talked about it extensively, but to give you like a brief look at it, it's called Project Nimbus. It is a $1 billion contract with the Israeli military, and since 2021, when the contract was announced, there was organizing that emerged out of like a anti-militarism cohort at Google, and it faced the same like prototypical discrimination and harassment that very similar to like what the rest of the movement faces right now. But at the core of it is like what agitated workers initially was this idea that like we didn't want our technology to be militarized. Like we wanted the focus to be on building tools for, I mean, it's almost silly to say now because big tech is just military. It's like completely militarized at this point, but the idea was that, oh, we wanted to stay true to our like company's initial, promises and that kind of thing. And yeah, at a baseline, it was like specifically, militarism. But before Project Nimbus was announced, there were other military contracts that Google tried to pursue, like Maven with the U.S. military, that were shot down. But when it came to Israel, like just at a baseline, even if it wasn't a military thing, what agitated a lot of us was the idea that Israel is an apartheid entity. It is an illegitimate state. It is occupying and ethnically cleansing a people. So just at a baseline, doing any financial relationship with a with a regime like that was a red line for most of us. But what pushed it over the edge, I think, I mean, for me specifically, but I think for a lot of people as well, was Israel was being afforded a very unique level of permissions in the technology we were building. Normally, whenever we build technology, we have control of the management, we have control of the security. But with Project Nimbus for Israel, and just to give like the quick details about it, it's basically Project Nimbus is like a cloud computing contract. So the idea was they wanted Google and Amazon to build these vast like server clusters inside what I would call occupied Palestine, but like Israel. They wanted us to build servers basically for them that they could use to do a whole host of things. And servers are very they can be very benign because you can use them to serve like almost any app or website to a client device, but they're also potentially very sinister because they can be used to train models, like we've seen Israel doing, like train models to be able to target and surveil Palestinians. So they were basically asking us, hey, build these like server cluster for us, and then relinquish security and management of those clusters that you built to the Israeli military, and just like close your eyes and walk away. And that was, I think, for me, just like so unique because I knew that Israel was afforded some privileges, like many, all the privileges, I should say. But this was the first time I was seeing it like, wow, we really are abandoning like basic engineering 101 viewpoint of like, security comes first, like make sure that's top priority. We were abandoning that for Israel. And I think, yeah, so at a baseline, we were being agitated just purely because Israel is an apartheid and nobody wants to have even commercial dealings with them. But on top of that, it was a military contract. And on top of that, it was something that we were, just relinquishing principles to abide by. So that I think that's really the trajectory. Like that's what agitated workers at Google. And then in our organizing, the harassment and discrimination we faced further agitated us and further pushed us to like want to continue organizing. And then I guess as far as like the question for like what kind of pushback we got, like Google was like comic book level, evil after, we started speaking out. It was like, I got called a terrorist for the first time, probably since middle school. It's been a while. And at the, like the peak of like software engineering world at Google, I was called a terrorist again. And when and then I got called into HR, and then they were actually, instead, it wasn't like, oh, we're so sorry you got called a terrorist. It was like, actually, that guy had a point. Like, we do want to accuse you of terrorism. Like, why did you say that? The thing that I had done was like, I basically said that the October 7th was, didn't happen in a vacuum. I was like, October 7th happened because the people were occupied. And that incurred like not only racism, but also the wrath of HR. So it was just like blatant racism, blatant discrimination. And I'll also never forget, I remember I received an email after organizing from some dude, and he basically, in the company, I should say, and he basically said that, yeah, I'll never forget this. He said, people in Gaza don't care about if they really cared about their kids, they wouldn't have kids. Right. So he said straight up eugenics on the corporate, platform, blatantly in the open, and did not get any sort of reprimand for this. He still works at the company, by the way. So like, if you're ever wondering like who's behind, Google, who's behind the tech, it's dudes like this, like absolute, frankly, psychopaths that believe that certain people shouldn't have children because of, where they live. So I just think it's like a ethical nightmare. They allowed people to film us, photograph us, stalk us without our consent. Not that you could ever even consent to, yeah, but they just allowed a degree of like harassment against organizers at the company that went against their own, terms of employment. Even when I was hosting a vigil for Mayor Obeid, who was a former Google software engineering intern who was killed in the first month of the genocide, Allah yarhamha. And we held a vigil for her, and the vigil was called out as hate speech. Like they were basically accusing us of hate speech because we were speaking out against, I don't know, we said that Israel was committing a genocide, and they said that this is hate speech. I feel like at this point I'm just like going through all the examples, but there was such a deep Zionist presence at the company that if you just twitched your thumb the wrong way, like you were going to get attacked. And we did experience that. And this is where we are right now as far as organizing is concerned. So the groundwork is there, but it is very hostile. And that's what we're kind of up against.
Thank you, Mohammed, for sharing all that. And thank you, everyone, for being here. I like that you brought up the concept of principles and morals, the principles of engineering, the principles of these tech companies and what they say they're meant to do, because that's why I organize. I organize because I believe in a free Palestine, and I believe that our tech companies and the technology we create can indeed do good for the world. I was working on a team at Cisco that was one of the purpose-driven teams. And I was running pilot projects with some of our tech that I saw actually do good, but the corporate morality facade cracked about a year ago, kind of starting with October 7th and the company's response to it. And of course, I want to recognize that the occupation, apartheid, and genocide in Palestine has happened long before October 7th. But the company was quick to give, Cisco was quick to give a response and hold space for our Israeli employees. They provided WebEx free for any Israeli company or organization that wanted it, and publicly happily announced that, yet held zero space for our Palestinian employees, which was very non-Cisco at the time. So as a community, as Cisconians, we responded twofold for our needs for space to mourn and heal what was happening in the world, and our company were denying it. And then knowing that our organization, the Israeli government, is a huge Cisco customer. There's publicly available information of many contracts, and one of our executive vice presidents reports into our CEO is based in Israel. And we have a deep history with Israeli acquisitions and such too. So to address the first, just need for space and community, we, as employees, started a WebEx group that's just like a Teams room, a chat space, that about 800 people joined. That started as our Palestine at Cisco community, then became a formalized employee ERG. And it was nice. It was fluffy. We held space for each other and did humanitarian give back events, but it didn't address the second part of the looming question that Cisco refused to answer of how is our technology being used by this actor who is being convicted of war crimes, that we are very happy to publicly partner with. So as employees, we asked the question. We created an open letter calling on the company to stop being in violation of its human rights policy, its code of business conduct, and international law. 1,700 Cisconians signed it. We emailed it to Cisco leadership. There were 9 demands calling for pay parity for our Palestinian versus Israeli employees, to publicly disclose what are our partnerships, to stop matching company funds and employee donations to the Israeli Red Cross because of racism claims, and to stop using our technology to do bad. Cisco leadership responded as publicly available in Alex's report, and kind of quickly shut down our initiative. They based it off of 35 Cisconians complained about the divisiveness of our open letter and the questions we were calling forefront. And I guess the voice of 35 trumped 1,700, according to Cisco. And that's kind of when the red flags really came out and how they started to kind of shut us down and silence us. They created these new expression guidelines that weren't even a policy, but were guidelines created after the fact to try and limit what we could talk about and how we could talk within the company platform. And with the signature mechanism or signature collection mechanism we were using, we had some really fantastic folks create a bot on our internal WebEx platform. They said we were violating some solicitation policy, couldn't point us to the clause directly, refused to answer when we pushed back on where we meant to, or how were we in violation of this, and at the end of the day said, well, we have final discretion on how we use Cisco tools, leadership said. So that was kind of the first shift that we saw, or first shift that I saw in our leaders starting to go against what are these Cisco morals that they tout. And as employees, it felt easy. We were hurt, we were enraged and concerned about how our labor was being used to support a genocide in an occupation. So we began challenging upwards to let them know that we are not okay with this and you will not silence our voice. So that's how it all began.
Great, thank you so much, both Mohammed and Sophia. And it's really an honor to be speaking with you all today. I mean, you all have lost your jobs for your advocacy for Palestine, and you have really been an example of what it looks like to stand in solidarity with Palestine. And thank you so much, Alex, for the work that you did on this report. It was really a pleasure to work with you. When thinking about this in terms of human rights, Hamla is a human rights organization, and I think oftentimes folks don't necessarily think of corporations when they think of human rights, but there are clear international standards that corporations do have to abide by when it comes to human rights, and the kind of foundational framework would be the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which clearly obligates that businesses have a standardized procedure to respect human rights, to actively protect human rights, and when there are human rights violations, to provide remedy for those human rights violations that their company may have been inadvertently or explicitly complicit in. And not only has that framework been laid out in the UN Guiding Principles, but also in times of heightened conflict, then the principles require that companies do what is called heightened human rights due diligence. And I think we can look to the fact that today the ICC issued arrest warrants for Israeli leaders that in this past year, the ICJ has said that what is happening in Gaza is a plausible genocide, and that how Israel is maintaining control over the West Bank is apartheid, and that there are specific obligations that corporations need to adhere to across all of those situations to ensure that they are not contributing to further adverse human rights impacts. I think all of those would suggest that we are in a heightened situation where corporations do need to abide by heightened due diligence to ensure that they are not contributing to human rights violations. And when it comes to workers, it's very clear that workers have the right to clear and transparent answers to ensure that the work that they are contributing to is not contributing to human rights violations. And so when workers like Sophia and Mohammed and so many others have clearly just asked their companies, their employers, hey, can we please have some transparency to ensure that what you're asking me to do on a day-to-day basis is not contributing to grave human rights violations? That is a completely respectable and okay ask to make. That it's really just been from Hamlet's perspective and from many perspective in the digital rights field, quite sad to see how these corporations have responded. And something else that I'll note is that we often see that the internal dynamics at play within these companies are a mirror of what their external product and policies look like. So Mohammed mentioned this, but if you read the report, this is kind of throughout many different companies, especially at Meta, that there seems to be a double standard when employees internally are speaking about Israel and Palestine for how folks' content is moderated and how folks are censored. And that is one of Hamla's biggest areas of work, is calling out the over-moderation of Palestinian voices and narratives on social media, and the under moderation of anti-Palestinian racism and hate speech. And so I think that it's quite clear that some of these really disturbing internal dynamics are reflected in the ways in which external digital rights violations are perpetrated by these companies. So yeah, that's what I have to say about that. Thank you.
Great. Thank you all so much for sharing. I appreciate all of your answers and all the continued work you're doing. And I very much appreciate the reminder of the UN guiding principles, and that corporations are obligated to maintain heightened due diligence, especially in the face of severe human rights violations. So it's a good reminder for us moving forward. The next round of questions, we're going to think more specifically about examples or indications that there have been systemic and structural bias against advocates for Palestine within tech companies. So once again, I'll ask Sophia Mohammed the first two questions and then the final question for Eric. So the first question, from the various tech worker testimonies analyzed in the report, it became clear that these tech companies hold systematic and structural bias against Palestinians and those who advocate for Palestine. For you, what sorts of indications existed that made you and your coworkers aware that this was the case? And could you share some of the most memorable issues you faced regarding bias, double standards, or discrimination with regards to company policy as it pertained to Palestinian advocacy, or in the uneven enforcement of said policies? And then for Eric, how has Hamle's work made visible the various ways in which tech companies are complicit in the ongoing violence in Palestine and now in the greater Levant? Thank you all.
Yeah, I think the tough thing with Google and I think other big tech companies that have prolific military contracts with Israel is that it really is as structural of a anti-Palestinian circumstance as you can get. I mean, like obviously internally, Google silences workers for speaking out, and obviously on their platforms, on YouTube, on different like social media platforms, etc. Palestinian voices are silenced, content is taken down, and that kind of thing is widely systemic. I think perhaps other companies that have workers, in the social media space, can speak about that even more. Like, I mean, Meta famously is currently being investigated for how effectively they took down content related to Palestine and related to Palestinian advocacy. But then on top of that, at Google, just like the reality is that given the military nature of the relationship, I mean, the structural violence is that we are literally killing Palestinians. I mean, I'm not working there anymore, alhamdulillah, but like, that company is directly contributing to the genocide. They're directly like making it easier for Israel to be able to target and slaughter Palestinians. They're directly making it easier for just the development of military technology by an apartheid state. And I think the really like funny part, and the Zionist victimhood narrative is somehow still so lively at Google. Like, I was honestly just thinking about the vigil that I hosted, and I was like, is that not like the silliest thing ever? Like accusations of anti-Semitism at like a company that has $7.2 billion worth of investments with like Israel. Like, you know what I mean? Like, it's just so silly at a certain point, that I don't know, like it reminds me of like how Palestinians are supposed to be like the perfect victims, and how it's like the fact of the matter is, like I'm literally being killed by a genocidal regime. Like, I don't have time to behave in a way that is perfectly reflective of what you need. Like, it's the same thing, like to a significantly lesser extent, obviously, but like with organizing in America, it's just like it's like you have to like prove yourself at every step of the way. And all I'm trying to say is like, can we terminate our relationship with a government that is killing people? And it's like, well, did you think about how that might make your like Jewish coworker feel for like a little bit? It's just like, that's how systemic it is. It's like so deeply built in that there's no basis of recourse against the company, and no basis to like push back against the narrative, which is why I think like education is so important, why I think like agitation is really important, because we do really need to build that base to be able to like push back against those systems. And then, yeah, I mean, as far as like examples of discrimination, I feel like I might have jumped the gun a little bit. I detailed like a bunch of them earlier on, but like that email I got, I still think about that like regularly, about how there's Googlers that are just like, yeah, these people shouldn't have kids, like they should just die. Or like how there's you know, people that, I mean, I think one of the greatest examples is like on the last day that I was there, when myself and my colleagues in No Tech for Apartheid, we were doing our sit-in, and you know, we were being told that we were being disruptive and that we were being, you know, violating company policy or whatever. And I remember like there were, you know, counter protesters that were sitting, you know, within 10 meters of us, speaking just as loudly as us and like laughing just as loudly as us, to try to drown out our protest. And then somehow like we were being too loud, but those people weren't being disruptive. So it was like, yeah, it's just an application of standards that is so obviously like anti-Palestinian and anti like Palestinian liberation that it just feels like silly to even like, sometimes when I think about it, I'm just like, they're so obvious about how biased they are, you know, and how deeply they want to make everyone quiet. And you know, another example I mentioned earlier was, you know, people would literally like record us and take photos of us without our consent and publish these photos online. Gross violation of company policy. Like, you are not allowed to take pictures of your coworkers. That's like, I'm pretty sure we had like 10 like modules, like, you know, those like work modules where you like learn about racism and learn about like company policy. Like there was probably 15 of those where they were like, yeah, don't take pictures of your coworkers, and they do it and nothing happens to them. So yeah, like I guess my point is, we faced a lot of silencing, we faced a lot of discrimination, but at the end of the day, like the systemic nature and the structural nature of the violence we were perpetrating was as violent as it gets. Like we were culpable in genocide. Like that company is culpable in genocide, and actively supporting and actively aiding in it. And that is where the root of the problem is. Yeah.
I'm laughing, Mohammed, because you're right. It's so like they're not even sneaky, or like they're not even intelligent, these PhD masters, 20 years in corporate, 40 years in corporate America leaders. And it is truly comical how hard they try to twist the rules or get us to stop pushing or apply policies with the obvious double standard, all to uphold their military tech complex, their alliance to Israel. It's comical. I guess the two greatest, or one of the biggest examples and most obvious ones, has been the response to employee relations, ER, or like HR cases we've seen. Myself and a group of others, we observed and saw some really horrible statements being made in one of the employee chats, the Connected Jewish Network community, where there was a small group of really horrible actors saying some really horrible racist, Islamophobic, anti-Muslim, anti-Palestinian, anti-Black, anti-LGBTQ plus statements. As recited in Alex's report, some of those were calling all Muslims terrorists and saying Palestinians were four-legged animals. And these were things that were in public employee spaces and platforms. So members of the space informed us of it, and a large group of us filed a large report, a 76-page report where we analyzed a few different comments and how like illegal and harmful some of them are. It took Cisco 2 months to get back to us on that report, and on that case, and they left us 2 months just hanging there. And we were not pleased with the resolve, I will say. Whereas there is a separate incident where the t-shirt that I'm wearing right now, Map of Palestine, our Palestine network at Cisco logo, and a logo of a Fortune 500 company that I will not disclose under my kafia. We were taking photos with some Cisco leaders in these t-shirts that we wore on a volunteering trip to Lebanon a few months ago, part of our Palestine Cisco community. And we were volunteering in refugee camps in Lebanon, supporting Palestinian refugees. Super proud of our trip, super proud to wear these t-shirts. A Cisco leader was captured in a photo with some employees wearing this t-shirt. And the Jewish community the connected Jewish community at Cisco was not happy about it. A few folks complained, said, why are our leaders like calling for the destruction of Israel? And within a matter of 5 hours, there was a comment from one of our Cisco leaders apologizing to the community for upholding statements of hate and bias. So I mean, it's math, it's obvious. It's 2 months for someone saying that all Muslims are terrorists and dehumanizing Palestinians in 5 hours about a t-shirt. It's comical. It's obvious and it's comical. So that one stung. Another one that stung, also related to these t-shirts. It's amazing how upset a Fortune 500 company is about t-shirts, but we'll take the win. Is the conversation we can have on social justice at Cisco. Cisco's been one of those companies that's walked the line of getting engaged in social justice conversation. As cited in Alex's report, they've sent out company-wide emails during Black Lives Matter and changes in reproductive rights in the US about future President Donald Trump getting shot in the ear, all the above, and they've acknowledged it as a community. Yet the conversation of Palestine is one that just they will not toe the line on for all the reasons that you said, Mohammed, about the systems they're trying to uphold. So I was working to get a blog out on the volunteering trip that I did to Lebanon with these t-shirts. And one had been published about a year ago. We were trying to get another one of the trip that we just went on, and another similar process of it took 2 months for the blog review team to come back and say, well, this actually goes beyond like the concept of volunteerism and seems like Cisco is taking a stance on a political issue, and we don't want to have social justice conversation here at Cisco. It's been the same standard they've applied to our Palestine network at Cisco inclusive community, that we can't have social justice conversation or a social justice chair. Whereas there's blogs externally available about our Native American network community and other communities that have social justice chairs, but it's not a conversation our group can have. So they try to just change the rules, and they're changing the rules retroactively, like different policies and the inability for communities at Cisco to talk about social justice is like a new rule as of 2 months ago. These t-shirts are against employee rules as of 2 months ago, whereas they were created in April. It's November. So it's hard to continue to push when they're retroactively stopping what they want us to do. But if you just approach with logic and say, well, and we always go back to the policies when we're engaging in conversation with leadership, that this policy was just created, or where am I violating this policy? When you try and fight ration with irrationality, sometimes you kind of expose that they're not doing it for the right reasons. I'll stop there.
Thank you both so much for detailing those examples. I think that they speak much louder to the issue than a lot of what I'm going to reference. But much of the work that Hamlet does is specifically around this idea of creating more awareness for the ways in which the tech that we use is connected to on-the-ground human rights violations. And Hamlet's mission is to create a safe, free, and fair digital space for all Palestinians. And in doing so, we really try to mainstream this idea of how unfortunately our digital spaces are being used against oppressed populations around the world like Palestinians. And so in trying to raise more awareness around this, we do a number of things. One of the main things that we do is we publish reports to try to create and increase the knowledge base around what is happening. So Delete the Issue, Alex's report that both Sophia and Mohammed were interviewed for and gave testimony for, is a great example of this. But a couple other that come to mind is a couple of months ago, we also released a large report that was on big tech and genocide, and it's not by any means a comprehensive report, but we demonstrated what we view as some of the most prominent examples of big tech's complicity in what is happening right now in Israel and Palestine, and some potential avenues for accountability. And we also recently issued a report specifically around Google and some of the ways in which Google has been complicit in the information warfare aspect of what is happening, how their ads policies on YouTube, for example, were manipulated to push out extremely inappropriate ad campaigns specifically to European and US audiences, to try to manufacture support and consent for an idea of collective punishment of all Palestinians after October 7th. That's just one of the issues that report goes into. So I would encourage you all, if you're interested, to look at our publications page that has a comprehensive list of all of the publications that we've put out. We're also trying to constantly document what the realities of our online spaces are. So we have two primary tools for that. One of them is our violence indicator, which scrapes data directly from online platforms and shows harmful content. And it's kind of unfortunately quite sad, but continually growing. So the last time I looked, I think harmful pieces of content directed at Palestinians in Hebrew over the last year were in the over 10 million pieces of content that we've collected. We also have a database where folks can submit cases for digital rights violations, HOR, that we collect that information, and then we distribute that out, and we try to intercede on their behalf so that we can help to provide remedy. So those are two sites that you can check out to see how we're trying to make these more visible. But besides that, we really try to be in connection with the local community in Palestine that is at the front lines of many of these digital rights violations, to ensure that as an organization we are responding to the largest threats, and we're also more and more in connection to the tech sector and to tech workers who are able to provide us more insight on exactly how these tools that we're told are supposed to be improving our lives, and that should be and could be improving our lives and making the world a better place, are actually being weaponized against oppressed communities and against Palestinians in this very moment, to ensure that the campaigns, the reports, the events like this one that we're putting on are highlighting the most prominent issues. So those are kind of the ways in which Hamla tries to approach raising awareness and ensuring that as more and more people are understanding the realities of Palestinians' day-to-day lives, they're also being educated on the digital aspect of Palestinian oppression.
Great. Thank you all so much for detailing some of those examples, and Eric for also sharing more about the critical work that Hamla has consistently been doing on these various issues. We're going to move to the last round of questions. I also want to pause to remind you all, if you have questions for the Q&A, to please submit them in the Q&A box rather than the chat, and we'll get to them at the end of this last round. This last round, we're going to think a bit more about the so what. So what do we do now? Thinking about accountability, thinking about next steps. So my questions for Sophia and Mohammed. At this stage, wherein we are over 1 year into what has been referred to as a genocide, and globally, publics are more aware of Western and specifically US complicity in supporting Israel's ongoing violence, through ideological, financial, and political backing? How have approaches to advocacy, specifically for tech workers, shifted and expanded? And to continue with that, I also wanted to add a bit more of a personal consideration. So in my interviews with 25 tech workers, including the two of you, I asked each person at the end of the interview to share their recommendations for moving forward. In asking this, I did not specify if this referred to personal recommendations related to motivation, care, or resilience, or to recommendations in terms of maneuvers that tech workers could take in their advocacy efforts. So could you share any recommendations you might now have for workers a bit after the fact, after we've done the interviews, more things have happened, right? Any recommendations you might have for workers, tech workers, or otherwise, who are pushing to hold their companies accountable in supporting and contributing to the ongoing violence against Palestinians? How do we keep advocating and working to create change in the today and moving forward into the future? And then for Eric, I wanted to ask, in what ways has Hamle offered its research and policy recommendations to hold tech companies accountable? Based on the testimonies provided in this report, what are some examples of the types of recommendations Hamle has for workers, tech companies, and civil society organizations? Thank you all. And yes, please add your questions to the Q&A box.
Yeah, so I guess for the first part, I think even though tech workers like operate in a different space, I think the circumstances that we're facing are honestly very parallel to like the circumstances that the movement for Palestinian liberation is kind of facing in America in general. Like we protested, we escalated, we spoke out, like we incurred the wrath of the law, got arrested, we sacrificed our jobs. So it's like we've sort of unfortunately exhausted a lot of those like options. And even now, like the protests that are still happening, I feel like a lot of people are realizing that the approach has to shift. And I think where that is like mainly with agitation and education. Like I think, and this is probably everyone else's opinion, but I think that with numbers is how we can make change. And that's not gonna grow unless we are like making a concerted effort to like mobilize tech workers and agitate tech workers and sort of like do the education necessary to get them like involved in organizing. I also think like tech workers are stereotypically like really apathetic and that kind of number, but I actually don't believe that like that has to be the narrative. I think that there's probably a point, you know, for everyone where as unbelievable as it sounds now that we are 1 year in a genocide and like still many tech workers aren't organized, I do think that there is like a way to get them invested, get a lot of them invested in it. And then as far as I think like the recommendations for like what I would say like tech workers should do is like, obviously if you're not organized, that's the first place to start. Like find people that are invested in the same cause as you, put on weekly meetings, discuss agitation tactics, flyer, like just start that process at the very least if it's not already there. And if it is already there, like join it and support it as much as you can. Yeah, like I said it, but I'll say it again. Like the only change that we can induce is going to come with numbers. And like this really is like we really are on like the front lines. Like the American corporate world is like the last like vestige of hope for Zionism. Like it really is. It really after this it falls, it's over. Like you know what I'm saying? Like after American imperialism and American corporate interest in the Zionist entity falls, the entire thing is going to be done. Like the world has already abandoned it. So we really are like, it seems silly to think like, oh, like, you know, my company is small, like not really going to be big change. Like at your marginal investment in changing your company's work with Israel or like investment in Israel, like yeah, it's indescribable how effective it will be. So if you're not organized, please do that. And change will come, I think, with numbers mainly. So that's my take. Yeah.
I love your optimism, Mohammed. And yeah, I agree. And that's our power as tech workers is we can use our labor and use our voice to stop what is our leaders upholding this tech military complex. And allowing this genocide and this occupation to happen. Tech is traditionally not an industry that has mobilized much historically. We've been paid well and kind of kept our heads down, and it's been really empowering to see that change. But while we're in this change, there's a lot of fear. I've talked to a lot of Cisconians, part of this group of 1,700 of us, and a lot of people are kind of fearful to stick their neck out. But the beauty of organizing and creating a collective voice is you are empowered by the rest of your group. So our Bridge to Humanity group, our Palestine Network at Cisco group, specifically Bridge to Humanity, we are over the corporate morality facade. And we've tried to appeal to Cisco's morality we are Cisco, we've appealed to Cisco leadership's morality. And that's failed. They've told us by ignoring us with the open letter that we are okay putting profit and our alliance to this genocidal actor over the concern of our employees, the concern of how your labor is being used and our impact in the world. So what that means for us as workers is we got to show up in a different way and apply more pressure and not stop being loud and remembering our power as workers. So the recommendation that I would leave the group with, everyone, if you are organizing right now, and if you haven't started working with EWOC, the Emergency Workers Organizing Committee, please go do so. We have been partnered with an EWOC consultant for the past few months, and they have been beyond helpful in giving tips, tricks, best practices on how to best organize and accomplish your goals in organizing. Our EWOC consultant is also kind of like our organizing therapist. And something he has reminded our community with that I will share with you is do not lose your imagination. When we go through traumatic experiences like this and fight this fight that is a marathon of stopping the genocide and freeing Palestine, the first thing we lose is our imagination and our hope. And each action we are taking is towards this dream of a free Palestine. And if we lose our imagination, we can't get there. So do what you can to nourish yourself. Remember what it is you're working for. Stay hopeful, stay optimistic, and don't let your company take away your power and your imagination as you advocate.
Great perspectives there. Thank you both so much for those perspectives. My recommendations are maybe a bit more dry, but hopefully also quite clear cut, and are coming directly from Alex's report, and I think are laid out quite clearly and entirely based in international understandings of human rights. For companies, what Hamlet would recommend is first and foremost that companies respect workers and protect digital rights. I think that there's really no circumstance in which either of those things are not paramount to any corporation and are not the obligation of any corporation. So respecting workers, respecting the calls of asking for transparency simply to ensure that the work that you are asking your workers to do day in and day out is not contributing to adverse human rights impact is really a very fair and quite frankly low bar for corporations to meet. And past that, we would also recommend that corporations commit to heightened human rights due diligence, and not only committing to heightened human rights due diligence, but really in the spirit of accountability and transparency. Those things should be made public. So it's oftentimes heard that corporations are going through the proper channels to ensure that they are doing their appropriate due diligence, but there is no proof, there's no transparency, and with no transparency, there can be no accountability. So we think that it is really paramount for corporations to make those due diligence processes public. For workers, we would say, know your rights. That is so important, to know your rights and to know what you are and are not able to do in the workplace. And past knowing your rights, to collaborate not only with each other across the tech sector, but also to know that there are civil society actors that are out there that are willing to support you and the work that you're doing. I would just shout out one of Hamla's close partners, Palestine Legal, that I know many tech workers are connected with, that are able to provide legal support for folks that are inappropriately targeted for their advocacy for Palestine. And we would also recommend that workers demand a human rights impact assessment, which is similar to human rights due diligence, but a human rights impact assessment is really kind of a rear view look at what has happened already. So when there's been a situation like what is currently happening in Gaza, a human rights impact assessment lays out clear procedures and guidelines for how companies can look at how they engage with that with that situation, and provide kind of a postmortem analysis of where they may have fallen short, where they may have been complicit in human rights violations, and what they need to do to remedy those actions. And similar to the human rights due diligence, I think it is imperative that those processes are made public, because once again, if they're not made public, then there is no room for accountability. For civil society, we would recommend that civil society support workers. And we would also recommend, for all of the same reasons that I just stated, that civil society demand human rights impact assessments across the tech sector for these companies. And I'll go one further, and I'll say that there are also recommendations and demands for state actors. And state actors should be strengthening regulation. By and large, across the globe right now, most states are letting big tech regulate themselves, with very few exceptions. And that is no longer feasible. And I think for there to be free, fair, and safe digital spaces for all people and for Palestinians, we need stronger regulations in the tech sector. We also need states to protect their workers and to respect international humanitarian law. So those are kind of, by and large, the recommendations that we would really hope for coming out of this report.
Great. Thank you all so much for taking the time and for your very thoughtful answers to the last 3 rounds of questions. I really appreciate it. We're going to move to the Q&A. I also wanted to remind folks again, if you have further Q&A questions, please submit them in the Q&A box. Also, the link to the report has been shared in the chat, as well as links to Hamla's other reports that we had mentioned in our conversation, as well as the violence indicator, the horror indicator, and other Hamla information. So please check that out. I'll also be sharing a link to the events page for the Tech Workers Coalition, who is our co-host for today's event. And with that, we're going to move to the Q&A. So the first question that was submitted is a question from Mohammed. And the question is, how did such measures not stop you from advocating for the Palestinian cause and keep you organizing?
Yeah, I guess like measures probably being like the like repression and silencing and everything. Yeah, I mean, I think by that point I was probably already like really radicalized, and like I think also there's a comparative suffering aspect of it. Like I genuinely didn't believe that I had the right to not organize as someone that had substantial privilege and who was contributing to a company that was like complicit in genocide. So like I felt like it's kind of like the same idea I have about like living in America. I'm like, by living here, I feel like I don't have a right to not organize, because by being here, I'm contributing to global oppression and American imperialism. So just like being in Google, I felt like from just like a pure moral and ethics standpoint, I didn't have a right to like give up from oppression, or from repression, I should say. But yeah, then like I think, yeah, by that point I was already radicalized, and like my conviction that like the world is like ephemeral, and like I'm Muslim as well, so I just like felt like it was more important to do something that was like correct rather than to like stress about like if I was going to find a new job or that kind of thing. Like it just felt like pennies in comparison. So that's kind of the answer. I just didn't feel like I had the right to not organize, you know. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much. And then the final question, one after this question for the sake of time. This could go out to everyone on the panel. So Sophia, Mohammed, and Eric. The question is it possible with the current alternatives to actually boycott these tech companies? What is the best method, in your opinion, of forcing them to stop supporting the Israeli sector?
I can comment briefly. Anything is possible, right? There are alternatives to majority of the tech companies that were cited in the report. It's challenging though, but what our companies have shown us is that money is power, and they are okay putting profit over not committing potential human rights violations and working with and profiting off of violent actors. So I mean, our power as consumers is our voice, our purchasing power, our knowledge. So definitely look into alternatives. And I will say Cisco, as of recent, just became a BDS target, and we have a BDS page. So go and check us out there.
Excuse me. Yeah, I think Google is sort of in a similar situation, but I don't think I think we're sort of on the BDS pressure campaign just because of how deeply intertwined Google is with most people's lives. I think at this stage, like calling for an outright boycott of Google products is like not seen as the most strategic thing, just because it doesn't feel like we can mobilize behind that entirely. But I'm all for, if anyone wants to stop using Google products, I support that. They're terrible, don't use their products, but I won't outright call out for a boycott just because I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done before we can actually make that effective.
I'll just add that I think, we're most powerful when we act collectively. And I think whenever we can try to act in mass, in people power, rather than thinking about individual actions that we can take, we're probably going to be more successful. And unfortunately, we still live in a world where the issue of Palestinian oppression is still obfuscated, and many people, for a number of reasons, are yet to understand the true realities that Palestinians face on a day-to-day basis. And when it comes to any of these issues, I think our foundational work is really still to try to raise awareness for what is really happening in Israel and Palestine. And when we think about the tech sector, kind of always be thinking about how tech and the digital tools that we use are complicit in on-the-ground human rights violations. And as global awareness rises, I think that there will be a natural fade away from some of this complicity, but we are unfortunately still quite far away from that place. And I think that is still our first and foremost work that needs to be done.
Great. Thank you all so much. With that, we're going to start to wrap up. I just want to thank everyone for joining. Thank you to the Tech Workers Coalition for co-hosting this event. And thank you to Hamla, especially for making this important research possible and visible. And we really hope to connect with you all soon at future events and reach out to us if you need anything. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you,
Take
everyone.
care.